College killer thought he was free. The shocking truth. The rain pattered against the windows, soft at first. But soon it grew louder, more urgent. He sat in the dark, breathing slowly. The air was thick, damp. The room felt smaller than it should. The shadows crept along the walls, stretching, folding in on themselves. His fingers twitched. He wasn't supposed to be here. The whole plan was supposed to be flawless. No one would know. No one would catch him. Not this time. The university was quiet tonight. Too quiet. The clock on the wall ticked too loudly. The sound of it felt off. His heart raced. Was there someone else? He couldn't tell. Not yet. But he could feel it. Something in the air was wrong. The shadows moved again. He blinked, eyes adjusting to the dim light. Nothing. Only the corners of the room seemed to press in closer. The faintest creak of floorboards echoed. Too perfect. It was nothing. Or was it? He stood up, slowly, as if the floor might give way. Every step felt too heavy. Too loud. But he kept going. The door. He had to make it to the door. His hand hovered over the handle. Then, the unmistakable sound. A breath. A voice. Barely a whisper, but it sliced through the silence like a blade. "You're not alone." The cold air wrapped around him. He turned, eyes wide. Nothing. Just the empty space. But it felt like something watched him. He stepped back, heart pounding. The door seemed farther away. The shadows seemed closer. His pulse quickened. The walls felt like they were closing in. He couldn't breathe. Every part of him screamed to run. But his feet were glued to the floor. A flash of movement. He wasn't alone. The door. He had to get to the door. Now. He lunged for the handle. Just as his fingers grazed it, the light flickered. For a split second, the room was bathed in complete darkness. And in that moment, he felt it. Cold hands on his back. His vision blurred. The room spun like a carousel, dizzying and endless. The floor beneath him felt distant, far away. He tried to crawl, but his hands slipped in the dark. Blood smeared across the cold tiles. It tasted metallic in his mouth. He gagged, gasping for air. The shadow moved again, slow, deliberate. A presence in the darkness. Watching. He could barely lift his head. Something cold touched his face. Fingers soft but firm. A slow, deliberate caress. Still alive. The voice was mocking now. The cold in his chest, the warmth of his blood. He tried to focus. The pain was unbearable. He blinked, vision fading. The shadow loomed over him, its form rippling. Why are you doing this?" he gasped, words jagged, choked. The shadow bent down, inches from his face. Its breath was like ice. "Because you thought you could get away with it," it whispered. His heart thundered. He remembered now. The bodies. The lies. The carefully planned escape. You were never supposed to make it out. A laugh. Dark and hollow. He twisted, desperate, trying to push away, but his strength was gone. The room seemed to grow even darker. Darker than before. The shadow's figure was shifting, contorting. "Do you feel it now?" The voice was close, impossibly close. "Do you feel what happens to those who think they can escape justice?" He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. His throat burned. The cold was consuming him. The walls seemed to close in faster now, the space shrinking. Pressure. Everywhere. His body felt heavy. Tired. His vision darkened further, edges blurring. He tried to scream again. But his body wouldn't obey. The last thing he saw before the world slipped away was that grin. That twisted, cruel grin. Then nothing. There was no light. Only darkness. A suffocating void that pressed in on him. His senses seemed to disappear one by one. He couldn't feel his limbs. Couldn't hear his breath. Just nothing. Then the voice again. This time it was distant. Echoing. "Is it over?" His mind screamed for answers, but nothing came. Time stretched thin. An eternity, it seemed. Slowly, painfully, he became aware of something. A tingling at the back of his mind. A whisper of sound, almost too faint to hear. His eyes snapped open, but there was nothing to see. Still, the sensation grew. The air felt thick, dense, like something was pressing against his skull. Something ancient, something watching. Where am I? His voice was barely a rasp. The answer came, but not from any visible source. It was a thought, a presence, swirling through him. You're not dead, it said. Not yet. He tried to move, tried to stand, but the weight of the air around him kept him anchored, immovable. You've crossed a line, the voice continued, this time more forceful, closer. But you still have time. A choice. If you're willing to take it. His pulse thudded in his ears. Choice? He had no strength. No will. Nothing to offer. Do you want to live? The voice asked, a hint of amusement in the question. He couldn't answer. Couldn't form the words. Then came a sudden sensation. A sharp, piercing cold shot through him. It cut through the haze in his mind. A rush of awareness. Pain. The blade. The blade that had dropped to the floor, the cold metal still fresh in his skin. He could feel it now, as if it were inside him. The shadow was still there, somewhere in the darkness, pulling at his very soul. And then the question lingered, thick as smoke, curling around him. Do you really think you can escape this time? A figure emerged from the nothingness. It was tall, blurred, its edges shifting like smoke. It reached for him, its hand cold, unfeeling. He tried to pull back, but his body wouldn't respond. A strange, unnatural stillness filled the space. The figure was closer now, its face forming in the void. Eyes, black, endless, hollow. The smile stretched wider. And that was when he understood. There was no escaping. Not from this. Not from what he had become. Not from the consequences of his choices. The shadow leaned in. And in the silence, it whispered one last thing. You can run, but you'll never leave. The words hung in the air, suffocating. His breath was shallow, barely a whisper in the void. The figure's smile deepened, impossibly wide, stretching to the edges of its face. It wasn't just a shadow anymore. It was everything. Its presence seeped into his very being, gnawing at the edges of his soul. He wanted to scream, but the sound was trapped in his throat. The cold was unbearable. His skin felt raw, exposed, as though the very fabric of his existence was being torn apart. The figure's hand reached out, hovering just inches from his face. He recoiled, but his body betrayed him, frozen, unmoving. You thought you could outrun your sins, the shadow whispered, its voice now like 1,000 voices, echoing in his skull. They never forget. A twisted, harsh laugh followed. His heart hammered in his chest, but no matter how hard he tried, it wouldn't stop. It felt like it was being ripped from him, piece by piece. The figure tilted its head, studying him with those dark, abyssal eyes. Did you think death would save you? It asked softly. He tried to move, tried to fight, but the words paralyzed him. No, he thought. Asterisk, no. It's not over. It can't be asterisk. But deep down he knew. It was too late. The shadows around him began to swirl, faster now, tightening, pressing him in. His body throbbed with pain. The more he struggled, the tighter the grip of the darkness became. The void closed in on him, suffocating, until all he could do was wait. Wait for what? What was left? There were no answers. Only the cold. Only the endless darkness. Then, in the midst of it all, there was something that shouldn't be there. A light. Weak. Flickering. But there. He reached toward it. It was his only chance. Fight. His hands moved, trembling, the last bit of strength draining from him. He could almost touch it. The light burned his skin, but it was warmth. Hope. A second chance? The figure laughed again, its voice dripping with malice. You think you can escape it, it growled. The light flickered. A scream tore from his throat, his body seizing in pain. And then the light went out. The darkness swallowed him whole. There was no more fight. No more escape. And the last thing he felt was the cold, the endless, crushing cold of regret. The cold stretched on, endless, suffocating. His mind teetered on the edge of consciousness, flickering in and out. Darkness pressed in relentless. There was no escape. No more choices. Just the weight of it. The absence of time. The shadow still hovered near, its presence like 1,000 suffocating hands, holding him in place. A faint sound, distant and hollow, began to echo in the dark. A heartbeat. Slow. Unsteady. But it grew louder, more insistent. It was his. Or was it? The air around him thickened again, the pressure growing. A voice far away whispered his name. His name. He couldn't remember the last time he had heard it. It felt like a lifetime ago. Like another person. His body felt like it was made of stone now. Heavy, numb, distant. But then something shifted. The cold didn't feel as cold. The air wasn't as dense. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but there was movement. A tug. A pull. His mind screamed, desperate to understand. What was happening? The heartbeat, once distant, was now right in his chest. Thumping. Erratic. Faster. And with it, the presence in the darkness pulled back. The grip loosened. The weight on his chest eased, just a little. He felt himself falling, not into the dark, but away from it. His hands twitched. A flicker of feeling returned to his limbs. The darkness around him seemed to waver, unstable. He gasped. Air. Real air. His lungs burned as if they had been starved of it for too long. Was this a way out? Could he escape after all? The heartbeat was pounding now, filling his ears. But something was wrong. He wasn't alone anymore. The air shifted again, thickening, heavy with intent. And then the voice. This time, it wasn't a whisper. It was sharp, clear, authority in every syllable. You're not free. The words sliced through him like the blade. No. He couldn't be here again. He couldn't be trapped again. His eyes snapped open. But it was no longer pitch dark. There was a faint, flickering light. A figure stood in front of him. The shadow was gone. But the figure wasn't. Not exactly. It was familiar, but twisted. Himself, but not. The eyes staring back at him were his, but black, pitch black, like endless voids. The grin stretched wide, impossibly wide, like before. Did you really think you could escape me? It asked. The words tasted of cold iron. His chest tightened. He couldn't breathe. The air around him began to pulse, like a heartbeat. His heartbeat. He reached out, desperate. But his own reflection stepped back. Smiling. Welcome back, it said. The cold returned, swallowing everything once more. And the darkness wrapped around him tighter than ever. The cold cut through him, deep and sharp, like ice carving into his veins. He tried to scream, but no sound came out. The figure, asterisk himself asterisk, stood before him, the darkness swirling around its form like a storm. Every movement it made was fluid, unnatural. The grin never faltered. You really thought you could outrun the past, didn't you? It whispered, its voice a mocking echo of his own. His mind reeled. How? How is this possible? Was it a dream? A nightmare? No. It was real. His reflection was alive. Alive, and worse, it was mocking him. You've been running for so long, haven't you? The figure continued, its voice slow and deliberate. But you've never gotten away. Not really. It reached toward him. A hand, cold and pale, like his own. But twisted. Fingers brushed against his chest, sending a wave of icy shock through his body. No matter how far you run, it murmured, I will always find you. The air thickened again, pressing in from all sides, choking him. His body froze. He could feel the weight of his past closing in, suffocating him. The room, if it could even be called that, pulsed with an eerie rhythm, like a heartbeat that wasn't his own. The walls seemed to bend inward, stretching like they were alive. He was alive. Why are you doing this? He rasped, voice breaking, barely a whisper. The figure tilted its head, eyes wide and unblinking. I'm doing this because you've earned it. Every step, every lie, Every drop of blood you've spilled, it's all been leading here. His heart pounded. The walls were closing in. The air was too thick to breathe. You killed them. You thought you could be free, but death doesn't let you go. Not ever. The figure's fingers tightened around his throat, not pressing, but pulling. It wasn't physical. It was a force. A pull. A pull to something deeper. To something darker. And he could feel it. His own darkness, twisting, writhing inside him. Everything he had tried to forget. Every face. Every scream. Every victim. They were all there now, swirling inside him like ghosts. A cacophony of lost souls. He could feel their anger. Their hatred. Their judgment. The figure's lips curled in a sadistic smile. You're not free, and you never will be. A wave of cold washed over him, and suddenly, his feet were lifted off the ground. The darkness wrapped itself around him, pulling him upward, forcing him to look into the reflection. His reflection. It wasn't just a reflection anymore. It was him. But worse. Far worse. You'll always be here, the figure whispered. Trapped with the memories. Trapped with me. His vision blurred. The world around him spun again. And just as it felt like everything was about to snap, just as he felt himself breaking apart, the world went black. Completely. And in that blackness, there was only one thing left. A heartbeat. Not his own, but his. The darkness had finally consumed him. And this time there was no escape. The heartbeat grew louder, thumping in his chest like a drum. Each pulse felt like it was shattering him, piece by piece. He tried to move, to fight, but the weight of the darkness held him in place, pressing in from all sides. His mind screamed, desperate for release. But there was nothing. Only the heartbeat. He opened his mouth to scream, but no sound escaped. His lungs were on fire, begging for air, but the air was thick, dense, suffocating. It felt as though he were being submerged in water, drowning without the release of death. The shadows closed in tighter. They weren't just around him. They were inside him. He could feel them, crawling beneath his skin, invading his thoughts, his memories. Each breath felt like an effort, every movement unnatural. The heartbeat kept pounding, louder now, deafening, filling his ears. Asterisk boom. Boom. Boom asterisk. It wasn't his heartbeat. It was the heartbeat of something else. Something ancient. Something hungry. The cold burned through his veins, sharper than before. And then the voice. The voice that had followed him, haunted him. Asterisk mocked asterisk him. You should have known better, it whispered, far too close, as if it were right in his ear. Death isn't an escape. You've always known that. No one ever escapes what they've done. He tried to move again, but his limbs were numb. His body felt heavy, too heavy, like it didn't belong to him anymore. The air pressed against him, like it was thickening, solidifying. And then, the reflection reappeared. Not in front of him, not beside him, but inside him. He saw himself, asterisk his true self asterisk, stretching out of the darkness, twisted and broken. The same eyes, but they were black now. Hollow. The same mouth, but it twisted into a grin that wasn't his. You thought you could run away, the reflection said, its voice distorted, like it was coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. But you never understood the truth. It's never been about running. It's about facing what you've done. The ground beneath him shook. A low, rumbling growl vibrated through the air, from everywhere, from inside him. The heartbeat grew faster, stronger. And then the reflection laughed. It wasn't his laugh. It was a hollow, empty sound. Look at you now, it mocked. Running in circles. Trapped by your own guilt. The darkness around him seemed to pulse with its own malevolent energy, swirling in the shape of faces, eyes, hands. All the people he had hurt. All the faces of the ones he had left behind. He closed his eyes, but they were still there, pressed against his eyelids. Their faces, their whispers, their accusations. The walls of the room bent, twisted. The heartbeat was everywhere now. Asterisk boom. Boom. Boom asterisk. He couldn't escape it. He couldn't escape them. And then it stopped. Everything. The heartbeat. The whispers. The faces. The darkness faded, but only to be replaced by an empty, suffocating silence. And in that silence, he was no longer alone. He was them. He was the reflection. He was everything he had ever tried to outrun. And as the silence stretched on, deep and endless, he finally understood. He would never escape. Not now. Not ever. The silence was overwhelming. It pressed against him like a physical force, suffocating. But it wasn't peace. It wasn't relief. It was the silence of imprisonment, of an eternity locked in a place where time no longer mattered. He tried to move, but his body felt wrong. Like he wasn't in control anymore. Like his own skin wasn't his. The darkness around him wasn't gone. It had simply changed. It was now a part of him. A weight. A presence. A consuming emptiness. He could feel it, crawling under his skin, whispering in his mind, wrapping around his thoughts. The reflection, himself, lingered at the edges of his consciousness, its presence like a shadow hanging over everything. It wasn't just watching him. It was him. The eyes in his reflection, those hollow black eyes, they were his. But they weren't. They were the eyes of something else. Something ancient. The darkness twisted and churned inside him, like it was trying to break free, trying to spread through his mind, his soul. The more he resisted, the tighter it gripped. "You're nothing," the reflection whispered again, its voice soft, cruel. "You always were nothing." His chest tightened. His throat burned. The darkness within him laughed. And it was no longer just a laugh. It was a scream. A scream that echoed in the empty void. Boom. A pulse. The heartbeat. Louder now. Faster. The sound vibrated in his skull. It wasn't just a sound anymore. It was a force. The walls of his mind cracked. Shattered. The heartbeat drowned out everything else. Boom. 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 It was his heartbeat, but it wasn't. It was the rhythm of something older, something darker, something that had always been there waiting. The reflection stretched, and suddenly, it was everywhere. Everywhere he looked, it was there. Himself, twisted, contorted, grinning that terrible grin. "Look at you," it taunted. "You think you're escaping? But you've always been here. Always will be here." He tried to scream, but no sound came out. His body was no longer his own. His thoughts weren't his. His past, his guilt, his sins, they all consumed him. The reflection was him, but worse. It wasn't just a part of him anymore. It was his soul. And there, in the center of it all, was the truth. The reflection wasn't just him. It was what he had become. Everything he had buried deep inside, everything he had denied, was now flooding back to him, rising up in waves of unbearable pain. His mind was shattering. Every memory, every choice he had made, every life he had ruined, was pressing down on him. And in the middle of it all, the reflection, his twisted, black-eyed self, whispered, "You've always known this truth." The walls of the darkness began to close in on him again, tightening, suffocating. But now he didn't even try to fight. Because deep down he understood. There was no escape. He was never going to leave. And as the walls crushed in around him, he realized with a sickening clarity that the heartbeat, his heartbeat, wasn't fading. It was only getting louder, and louder, and louder, until it consumed everything. The heartbeat was deafening now, an unrelenting drum that echoed through his mind, through his body, through the very core of his being. Boom. 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 It vibrated in his bones, in his skull, in the pit of his stomach. The air itself felt thick, heavy, as though the weight of his sins had filled the space, pressing down on him until he could barely breathe. The reflection, his reflection, hung in the darkness, grinning that twisted, sick smile. It wasn't him anymore. It was a monster, a nightmare. A mirror of everything he had become. The reflection tilted its head, its hollow eyes never leaving his. "You think this is the end, it whispered, its voice dripping with malice. You think you can just fade away? No. You don't get to rest. His heart pounded, but it wasn't his heart anymore. It was the reflection's heartbeat. The rhythm of something darker, older, something that had been feeding off him for so long. The ground beneath him was shaking now, like the very earth itself was crumbling under the weight of his guilt. The walls of darkness were closing in, tighter, faster, and he could feel them pressing against him, pushing him deeper into the void. He struggled to move, to escape, but his body was frozen, trapped in place. He wasn't himself anymore. He had become part of the darkness, part of the reflection. And that realization hit him with a sickening finality. There was no more separation. There was no more escape. The reflection was inside him. It was him. The shadow, the voices, the heartbeat, it was all one. And the reflection whispered again, its voice sweet and cold, "You belong to me now." He wanted to scream, to fight, but his mouth was sealed shut, his throat dry, like it had been choked by the weight of his own sins. His mind was splitting apart, fragments of memories, faces, voices swirling around him, like ghosts trapped in his head. Asterisk boom. Boom. Boom asterisk. The heartbeat, faster now, desperate. The darkness around him seemed to breathe, its very presence pulling him deeper, suffocating him. The reflection stepped forward, its grin widening. "Welcome home," it said, the words sweet, honeyed, and cruel. "This is your eternity now. You'll never escape. You'll never be free." The darkness pulled tighter, wrapping around his body, suffocating his thoughts. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't think. He couldn't. The heartbeats surged again. Asterisk boom. Boom. Boom asterisk. And then everything stopped. For a moment, there was nothing. Complete and utter silence. No heartbeat. No reflection. No dark walls closing in. Just nothing. His mind was empty, his body weightless. It was an illusion. A trick of the dark. Then the reflection's voice came again, clearer now, echoing in the silence. "You wanted to escape. But now you see. You were never meant to. You were always part of me." And as that final truth sank in, he felt the darkness wrap around him completely, consume him entirely. And then nothing. The heartbeat was gone. The reflection was gone. There was no light. There was no air. There was no time. There was only him. A soul forever trapped. A heartbeat that never stops. The silence that followed was oppressive, heavier than before. A void that stretched infinitely, swallowing every thought, every breath. But in that stillness, there was a flicker. A tiny spark of awareness. Something shifting. It wasn't peace. It wasn't escape. It was something else. Something worse. The heartbeat was gone, but it had left a hollow, aching emptiness in its place. Like a drum that had been struck too hard, leaving nothing but a ringing echo. A pulse. Not his. Not anyone's. The air was still cold. Colder than before. Then from the depths of that silence, a low sound emerged. Soft. Barely audible at first. Whispers. At first, they were indistinguishable, fading in and out like the wind rustling through dead leaves. But then they grew louder. Closer. Clearer. "I told you," a voice rasped from the shadows, its tone cold and familiar. "You'll never leave." The voice was his. And yet it wasn't. It echoed in his mind, like a memory he couldn't escape. A shiver crawled up his spine, though his body felt numb, lifeless, suspended in the nothingness. And then, without warning, a sharp, burning pain shot through his chest. He gasped. It wasn't real, but it was. The pain was there, deep, raw. It wasn't just physical. It was mental, emotional. It was everything. Everything he had ever done. Every life he had taken. Every lie. Every betrayal. Every choice. It all came crashing back at once, a tidal wave of regret, suffocating him. The whispers grew louder, their voices now distinct, like a chorus of ghosts. "Run, run, run." It was a chant now, low and rhythmic, pulsating in time with that awful, unseen heartbeat. And then he felt it. The cold fingers of the darkness reaching for him again. Not the reflection this time. Not the twisted version of himself. But something worse. Something older. The darkness was pulling him down again, deeper into the depths of his soul. Its grasp was firm, relentless. The space around him twisted, distorted. A face appeared in the shadows. A woman's face. Her eyes were wide with terror, unblinking, staring directly at him. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. Her face. It was one of the faces he had left behind. One of the ones he had killed. The whispers grew frantic. They were hers now. Why? She screamed in silence, her eyes begging for an answer. Why did you leave me? The darkness pressed in on him, suffocating his chest, his mind. I told you, the voice from the void repeated. You can't escape what you've done. The woman's face began to melt, twisting into something unrecognizable. And then another face appeared. And another. The faces of those he had betrayed, murdered, destroyed. They all stared at him. Silent, accusing. The darkness was feeding off him, off his pain, off his guilt. It wasn't a place anymore. It was inside him. It was him. The whispers came again, now chanting in one voice. A single unified sound. Run, run, run. And suddenly his body moved. Not by his will, but by some other force. His hands jerked forward, pulling him deeper into the abyss. He tried to scream, but no sound came out. The walls were closing in. The faces were closing in. The darkness was closing in. And just as he thought he could take no more, the walls crushed him. The faces melted into nothing. The whispers faded. And the heartbeat? It never stopped. It was now a part of him. Forever. The crushing silence returned, but this time, it felt different. It wasn't the oppressive stillness of the void. It was a heavy, suffocating stillness that clung to him like damp cloth, pressing against his chest, his throat. A silence filled with the weight of everything. The heartbeat, that infernal pulse, was no longer just in his ears. It was in his blood, in his bones, in the very core of him. Asterisk boom. Boom. Booma asterisk. It didn't belong to him. And yet, it was all he could feel. Each beat felt like an echo of his sins, of everything he had tried to outrun, tried to hide. But now there was no hiding. His eyes opened, though he wasn't sure he'd closed them. The space around him was not dark anymore. It was shifting. Flickers of light danced like fireflies in the corner of his vision. Shapes that weren't quite right. Distorted. Fractured. He was seeing them, but he couldn't grasp them. He moved, or at least tried to. But his body felt heavy, like it didn't belong to him anymore. Every part of him felt foreign, alien. There was no pain, but the absence of it was worse. The emptiness gnawed at him, a void that stretched on for eternity. And then the sound broke through the stillness once more. A voice. Soft at first. So quiet, it was almost a whisper. You could have saved yourself. He flinched, though there was no physical motion. The words didn't just come from the air. They came from inside. His head. His soul. The voice wasn't his. But it felt like it was. Like it was the voice of someone who had always been there. Someone he had buried long ago. You knew, the voice continued, growing clearer. You always knew what would happen. The choice was never a choice. He wanted to scream, but his throat was dry, his body still frozen. The reflection was gone. The faces. The shadows. The heartbeat. They were all fading into something new. But the voice remained. Now you're mine. The words echoed in his head, repeating in time with the heartbeat until they consumed him entirely. Asterisk boom. Boom. Booma asterisk. And then, all at once, the silence swallowed him whole again. But this time it wasn't empty. It was complete. And he knew, deep down, painfully, he would never escape. Not ever. The pulse faded, its rhythm becoming less a heartbeat and more a distant echo, reverberating through the depths of his mind. The oppressive darkness, once so suffocating, seemed to loosen its grip. The shadows began to pull away, retreating, unraveling like smoke in the wind. And for the first time there was stillness. A fragile kind of stillness. A quiet that seemed to stretch for miles, yet it was peaceful, almost serene. His body, though still heavy and numb, felt lighter. The suffocating weight that had been crushing him, the darkness that had consumed him, it all seemed distant now. Like it was fading into the past, slipping away into something that no longer had power over him. There were no more faces, no more whispers. Just silence. But it wasn't an empty silence. It was different. It was a presence. A gentle warmth began to surround him, like sunlight breaking through dark clouds after a storm. Soft. Welcoming. He breathed, slowly, deeply, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, it was his breath. Real. Alive. His eyes opened, though he wasn't sure if he had ever truly closed them. The world around him was no longer a void. It was vast. Wide. Infinite. There was light now. Soft, golden light that bathed the space in a warmth he hadn't felt in so long. He took a step, his feet barely touching the ground, and found himself moving forward. It wasn't just walking. It was like gliding, floating above the earth, as if the weight of his past, his guilt, had finally been lifted. The air was clean, fresh, untouched by the poison that had once clouded it. He felt no fear, no dread, no shame. There were no shadows here, no reflections, only freedom. A soft whisper of wind brushed past him, carrying with it a sense of quiet peace. The truth was simple, yet profound. He was free. Not in the way he had imagined, escaping into nothing, but free in the only way that truly mattered. He had faced what he could never outrun. And now he could let go. The path ahead of him was endless, stretching toward the horizon. But this time, there was no darkness, no reflection, no twisted past chasing him. There was only the soft light, and the knowledge that, at last, he was whole. He walked forward, not away from something, but toward something. And for the first time, he felt like he was finally, truly home. The darkness had faded, leaving only the dawn.